Games Workshop, the return of Warhammer Fantasy in 2024. Excited or too little, too late? Now, years ago, Games Workshop advanced the timeline, bringing us to the end times. And as a Warhammer Fantasy player, this was very exciting because the Warhammer Fantasy universe was kind of frozen in that moment. So you've got Storm of Magic, you've got some new books, you've got some army updates. It was one last push before Games Workshop literally destroyed the universe, literally discontinued the game, stopped production, and shifted everything to Age of Sigmar. It's one thing if a gaming system is not supported and it slowly dies out, or it's not supported, it's discontinued, but the community continues to support it. Games Workshop just blew up all the players, and destroyed everything deliberately to force players to shift to Age of Sigmar. Now, there are some really interesting things. Age of Sigmar, we did get some new kits. It's its own vibrant community. But now Games Workshop has been looking for some time, saying we need to boost profits. And we have all these machines, all these molds capable of making Warhammer Fantasy. Let's relaunch the old world. But this time we're going to do it with FOMO. You better get on board or you're going to miss out. I'm here to say, agree or disagree, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And I've got a giant Night Goblin army ready to go. I've got an Empire army ready to go. I use it for other systems. I use it for D&D. And this isn't just what Games Workshop did to its Warhammer Fantasy players, but the irony being what they did to their Warhammer Fantasy players by just destroying that community without regard to them. That's why I'm predicting that Warhammer Fantasy, the return, is not going to work out like they think. This is not going to be The Empire Strikes Back. Now, here's the framework of why I say that. What we saw with Warhammer Fantasy was this duality of two things: mass combat miniature battles. Yes, the setting was amazing, but playing a Warhammer Fantasy battle game was literally real time. Some armies were bigger than others. I mean, there is a big difference, Night Goblins versus Ogre Kingdoms, but you were looking at hundreds of models on the table, plus war machines, plus monstrous creatures, plus the terrain. I mean, it was really an amazing system. That takes time to build up. Plus, you have the community already in place. When they destroyed Warhammer Fantasy, you had like 30-something years of the game in play, 30-something years of players to bring in new players, 30-something years to demo it. Now you're rebooting it. You've lost almost all of your old players. There's a few maybe still playing Kings of War that put their army over to that, but you're going to relaunch a system from zero community. On top of that, the gaming community has shifted. And I'm not talking about the rule set of Warhammer Fantasy, if it's good or bad or needs a refresh. Let's just keep it as it is for a moment. The gaming systems have changed. Smaller models, tighter play, more dynamic rules, different interactions, not just you go, I go, you go, I go. Warhammer Fantasy, based on that and the number of models that are required to play, it's just too high, too much of a bar of entry to play. On top of that, the prices for Games Workshop, the prices for their miniatures are just too much to support that. It's one thing to play Warhammer 40,000. They're pushing you to play more and more, buy more and more. Certainly some armies tend to favor Horde if you're playing Tyranids or you're playing Orcs. Although even a Tyranid army that's a lot of models, you could have monstrous bugs. You've got knights, you've got other things that you could play a smaller, more elite army. But the armies in Warhammer 40,000, there's a little bit of pushback. Warhammer Fantasy, by its nature, big mass combat fantasy battles. To buy hundreds and hundreds of models for a community that doesn't exist right now, that would take 10 or 15 years to even remotely build up, it'll launch. I don't see it happening. Agree or disagree? Now, to finish this out, what I am excited about, and Games Workshop's going to pump out a lot of stuff, and there'll be some FOMO. If there are some smaller I want to say Warhammer Quest, if they have a Warhammer Quest type series, if they release it for that, if there's some supplemental smaller box standalone stuff, I would be interested in that, because I will give Games Workshop credit. The IP, the world, the narrative setting for Warhammer Fantasy is very unique, and it really is something special. It's a shame that they had to blow it up to kind of launch Age of Sigmar. They could have kept it parallel and see what happened. But they're going to start cranking up the machines, start cranking them up. 2024, the return of Warhammer Fantasy. Agree or disagree, I'm going to take the stand. Too little, too late.